the the stage to Dr. Nikhil Bhat.
Thank you, Dipankar. I feel very privileged to welcome you all for this very interesting session, as well as to welcome and introduce the speaker. So for this session, we have two speakers, two very distinguished and eminent speakers. They are Professor Gerald Schroeder and Professor Nowak Martin. Each speaker has about 40 minutes to present. When there are about 5 minutes left, I will gently remind the speakers to conclude the session so that we can have a fruitful interactive discussion, basically a session with question and answer for about 10 minutes. For the participants of this conference, they're requested to ask their questions through the chat box, which will be addressed after the talk is finished. Without further ado, let us proceed with the session. And I would like to introduce the first speaker. He is Professor Gerald Schroeder from the Aish Torah College of Jewish Studies in Israel. A very short introduction to Professor Gerald Schroeder. He is basically an applied physicist lecturing at Aish Torah College of Jewish Studies in Israel. He received his BSc in Chemical Engineering in 1959, MSc in Earth and Planetary Sciences in 1961, and earned his PhD in Nuclear Physics and Earth and Planetary Sciences in 1965, all from MIT. He has over 30 years of experience in research and teaching, serving various institutions and agencies, including MIT, Weizmann Institute of Science, and US Atomic Energy Commission. So in addition to that, his scientific works include the area of nuclear weapons disarmament and radiation control in uranium mines. He also invented and patented the first real-time monitor for airborne alpha, beta, gamma emitters. He has over 60 publications in internationally renowned journals, including Science. In addition, for over 25 years, he has been engaged in the study of ancient biblical interpretation and frequently writes and lectures on the extraordinary confluence of modern science and ancient biblical commentary. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Gerald Schroeder to start his talk. And Professor Schroeder, would you like to play the video first? Can someone unmute Professor Schroeder? We are not able to.
I think I am muted. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we are able to hear you. So would you like to play the video first?
Well, I would like the video to be played. Can the support team play that? I'm really not sure how to get. The link that I was sent should bring it up.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
5-minute video. I'm pleased to say it has over 3.5 million views on the parent site and over 5 million views web-wide. I had no idea it would be accepted this way. It was made literally standing on one foot, no script whatsoever. And then the people that made the movie put fantastically great graphics in it. I had nothing to do with the brilliance of the graphics. I have to tell you, in all honesty, it's not modesty. The graphics, their work, and I think it's.
My name is Gerald Schroeder. I have a, thank God, a strong science background from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, bachelor's, master's, PhD, 7 years in the physics staff. Seen a whole range of atomic bombs detonated, moved to Israel, met my wife, Barbara Sofer, a great writer, and then teach Torah and science. So luckily, I'm lucky that I have the two that come together. And one of the questions that I'm asked as a scientist is, how can a scientist really believe that there's something what we refer to usually as God? You know, is this metaphysical whatever acting in the world or producing the world? And the irony is, the question's really a non-starter. Science has, in fact, discovered God. And you can talk to the hardline atheists, and they will say, it looks like science has indeed discovered God. And how would that be? Well, if you take the trouble of going to the web and there type in WMAP, the initials for a satellite, it's a diagram that shows the development of the universe from the creation over time. It's a timeline. Every word on that diagram comes from the NASA site. It is the condensed knowledge of the scientific community of how the universe created and how it got to where we are today. Each of the lines, the vertical lines, is another billion years. Okay, you start from a burst of energy at the extreme left side of the diagram, and you end up at the far end with the oval. The oval is to indicate expansion in all directions. Of course, because it's a timeline, we can't show that on a single piece of paper. We see here, most amazingly, that on the extreme left edge, it shows a beginning to the universe. Now go back less than 50 years. If I were teaching that at Tech, a person could lose tenure saying that there was a creation of the universe. It sounds like it's Bible. Because less than 50 years ago, the overwhelming scientific opinion was the universe is eternal. There was never a beginning. The Bible is wrong from the very first sentence. And then we discovered, suddenly, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, the Bell Labs in New Jersey, the northeast of the US, discovered the echo of the Big Bang, the energy left over, which George Gamow, 60 years ago, predicted that if there had been a universe created hot and small, it would have exploded, and the energy would get more and more dilute. And Penzias and Wilson, these Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discover this energy that had been predicted overnight. The Bible got it right. There was a beginning to the universe. Now, the black in the diagram is nothing. It's not a vacuum. Vacuums are within that diagram, within that cone of expansion. Vacuums are empty space, and space is something. The black of the paper around the diagram is nothing. It doesn't fit in our human brain because humans think in a box made of time, space, and matter/energy. No human, as clever as they might be, as expansive as they might be, thinks out of that box. So when we say outside that diagram is nothing, we can use the words, but we can't conceive of nothing. It doesn't fit in the human brain. How are we going to have this idea, is there a God or not? Notice that the creation force isn't a three-letter word, G-O-D. If you look at the words carefully, it's a quantum fluctuations. That understanding was first brought down by Ed Tryon, brilliant human being, in the journal Nature, almost 40 years ago. The universe allows creation of something from nothing, provided you have the laws of nature, the quantum fluctuation. Tryon realized, and he published in the journal Nature, one of the two leading peer-reviewed journals in the world, that you can create something from absolute nothing, provided you've got the laws of nature, quantum physics and the laws of relativity. In other words, the laws of nature. So look what science has discovered. We can create the universe from absolute nothing, provided we have the forces of nature. Now, the laws of nature, the forces of nature aren't physical, they act on the physical. So if they create the universe, that means they predate the universe. So now we have a set of forces, we call them the laws of nature, that are not physical, that are able to act on the physical. They create the physical from absolute nothing. And they predate the universe, which means they predate our understanding of time. Put that together, it sounds very familiar. If you haven't noticed it, that's the biblical definition of God. There's only one nuance that's left hanging. We can talk about it another time, perhaps. Is that which created the universe, those forces active in the universe. But up to that point, science says you are correct. The definition of the biblical God is predates time, outside of time. God is not a physical being, is a force, and it creates the universe. You'll notice that the opening chapter of Genesis, the only name for God is Elohim, God as manifest in the universe. Science has indeed discovered the biblical God. Well, we just need one part left, crucial. That which created the universe is also active in the universe itself. The very fact that you're watching this now pretty much establishes that point.
What? I'm not muted now, right? What it's an extraordinary change in the scientific understanding, not just of the universe, of us. Can we show the slide that is that cone from NASA? Can that be put on the screen instead of me? Yeah. If we look at that amazing statement, at the extreme, the extreme right is blocked out, unfortunately, but what it shows is it shows the satellite that mapped these data. got 2 persons the Nobel Prize. But what this diagram says is probably the most important theological statement that science will ever be able to make. It relates to all religions that accept the fact of a creation of the universe. It's not merely biblical, it's all religions, because it says something phenomenal. That a burst of energy, notice what our studies in the sciences, I say I'm not part of this particular type of work, but I'll say as the scientific community has said. And since we find these data reported, for example, in journals like Science, etc., it is the combined understanding of our cosmic origins in the scientific community. A burst of energy, leaving aside what may have caused that burst of energy. But do you see what this diagram, I apologize, I make myself understand what this diagram says. The creation of the universe wasn't matter, it was energy, because that's all would be able to get condensed in what apparently seems to be, from the studies of the expansion of the universe and also from ancient commentary, a minuscule point. And that's the only physical creation. What the video should have said is that we see creation of the physical world from nothing physical, because there were these forces. There's virtual reality, as we know from all the studies that we have, which come only when we get into the quantum world. And that creation was a burst of energy. Now, it doesn't matter if it's 13.77 billion years, a gazillion years, a few days. What's amazing is that we accept as a scientific community that light beams, super powerful light beams, the energy of creation, can morph and morph again and morph again and morph again, and finally become so intelligent that they could create the satellite, which you see, you can't quite see it on my screen, but I hope you can see it. Beyond that oval, the satellite that mapped the universe, that these light beams changed, became to understand the universe, to wonder about it, and then to have the skills to make instruments like satellite to map the history of the universe and discover our origins. Light beams became alive. Light beams became conscious. Where does a light beam have the chutzpah, to use one of my favorite words, to have the chutzpah? Where does a light beam have the chutzpah or the knowledge to feel love, but excitement, glorious, all that the previous persons have said? It comes, how, where is it? A light beam can feel love? I mean, give me that's quite a stretch of imagination. But that is exactly what this diagram says, because our physical origins are at that extreme left of that diagram, that burst of energy. That's our physical origins. It wasn't matter, it was pure energy. And that energy, thanks to Albert Einstein, we know that energy and matter are 2 forms of the identical stuff, just as water and steam, both. Water is low energy, H2O, and steam is high energy, H2O. That we are the light of creation. It isn't poetry. But when you look in the mirror in the morning, and I tell your friends, you young students, you don't realize, but as years go by, it becomes more and more depressing to look in the mirror in the morning. But when you look in the mirror in the morning, you are literally looking, not poetically, you are literally looking at the light of creation in a special form called you. And the scientific community, through its discoveries of the world, accepts it. This is a reality. And just to give credit, the person who first presented this idea of a quantum fluctuation creating the universe, the statement on the extreme left, then is followed by inflation immediately after that. But the first person to publish this was Ed Tryon in 1973. It is and he published it in the journal Nature, again, one of the leading journals in the world. It's published in the USA. I'm talking to you from Jerusalem. It's you know, it is a sad, this is not on the topic of the talk, but I want to mention, it's a sad reality. Ed Tryran went to his grave with no acknowledgement that he was the person that first presented this article. You have to search far and wide. On the NASA site, I couldn't find it at all. To my embarrassment, my first book, I didn't mention him. I had to search, then I discovered the other books mention him. Ed Tryran summed up several years ago, summed up his understanding. I'm going to read his words exactly. In 1973, it occurred to me that relativity and quantum theory might imply the spontaneous creation of universes from nothing. If so, matter and energy would not be fundamental. I urge us to realize that significance, that's the significance of that sentence, that phrase. If so, matter and energy would not be fundamental, but they would be manifestations of underlying laws. Ultimate reality would be the laws of nature themselves. In a word, the mind of Einstein's God. That's interesting, because here we have suddenly, we always think of the Big Bang, and that is our physical beginning, but that would not be the essence of the underlying reality of this magnificent universe of ours. And if I could have that slide that shows, I think it's slide number 2. Slide number 2, just that when our universe is born, it is born with a myriad of laws of nature within it. The slide 2 is the I think I sent it to you. Can you bring that up? If not, it's just a list of a very few of the vast numbers of laws that are inherent in the universe from the beginning. They were always there. They were just discovered by our human intelligence over time. It's not that we invented those laws, we discovered those laws. And what this comes to tell us something amazing is, since all of those laws are representations of totally abstract symbols, but it's mathematics. And what we discover from just by looking at those laws is that our minds could derive these laws, which means our minds are in harmony. I'm quoting now from a biologist called Freud. And our minds are in harmony with the mathematics, that underlie the universe. But we invented mathematics. I mean, it was mathematics isn't part of our DNA. Mathematics was invented by seeing these relationships. I guess you'd say that when Nicholas Copernicus first published that the sun, for our solar system, that the sun was the center, and then and the earth went around it, and that was amazing. And then 7 decades later, approximately, Johannes Kepler published the laws of planetary motion. The laws of planetary motion, that's mathematics. It's totally abstract. It's totally abstract. Finally, then comes Newton with his Principia Mathematica, the famous statements that the world follows specific laws. The world follows specific laws, and I like to quote the John Polkinghorne, who describes it that our minds invented mathematics. This reveals a very deep fact about the nature of the universe, that we are somehow tuned to the workings of the cosmos, that something about human consciousness is in harmony with this mind of God. What is the mind of God? I would say that with the mind of God would be most perfectly revealed, not necessarily in whatever scripture persons read. I really don't think that is the case. because words are limited. And every word you use blocks you into that meaning of that word. The mind of God, to me, his understanding, is found in the study of nature. Because nature is the representation of the thoughts of God. And on a university in Maine, in one of the states, the Northeast of the United States, state Maine, Bowdoin College, nature's laws are God's thoughts. It's carved into the wall of the science building. Nature's laws are God's thoughts, and nature's laws, which in fact are the creation by God, are made manifest in the workings of the universe. And that tells us that if we want to find the work, God's essence as we know it in this universe, we have no, in my opinion, we have no idea the essence of God, outside of the universe. But in this universe, the essence of God found in this universe is best studied through the understanding of nature, because then there's no words limiting it. We just see, I'm happen to be looking out the window at the moment and seeing this wonder of nature. So we have this in this creation, and I would like now to move further and just jump to the final slide that I have, which is a increase in the IQ of the universe. And what we're seeing here is over time. First, I want to show something quite fortunate for the moment that we live, as my late colleague Arnie Nowak pointed out. We live in a very special time. That diagram of the universe that you saw, and you notice that the rate of expansion was actually increasing. As we all know, for novices, they won't know this, but the scientific community all realizes that the rate of expansion is actually increasing, with no understanding why, because it's clearly a force that we don't know. But why is it special that we live? Well, it took almost 14 billion years to get to a point where our minds could start building instruments to discover the laws of nature, the origins of our universe, the physical origins of our universe. Had it taken not 14 billion years, but I'd say just twice as long, 28 billion years. By that time, the universe would be so large and have expanded so much that outside of the local cluster of galaxies, all the light from the other galaxies would never reach us. We would think that we're more or less alone in this universe. The special time that we live in now is we can see deep. There's a limit to how far we can see also, but we at least can see enough of the universe so that we realize that there's billions upon billions of other galaxies. Otherwise, in several decades, in doubling the time that it would take us to reach this, as nature unfolded these miracles, we would not be able to do these studies as to what our position in the universe is. So we live in a special time. And what the diagram of this diagram, or we can't quite see the right side of it, but with this IQ diagram, also the quote from NASA, just in limiting it in words, that the Big Bang creation of energy produces energy and space in the beginning of our concept of time from nothing physical. And we get from that energy and physical matter, and then the matter becomes alive. Life develops a brain, and the brain seems to become a point of mind or consciousness, because if you look at the diagram that's on the board now, you'll see that in I, the origin of consciousness, we have the origin of life coming at about, the numbers are approximately 10 or so billion years after the creation. And then some number of approximately 3 billion years go by, and we have the origin of consciousness. Now, how do we know this? It's called the Cambrian explosion of life. The Cambrian explosion of life brought into being every basic body plan that exists today. Our body plan enters as a let's say a primitive fish type of animal, has a notochord, and has eyes. Other body plans also have eyes. Well, what does an eye require? And what's the purpose of an eye? It has to be able to react to it takes information in and reacts to that information coming in, which is clearly first of an origin of consciousness, that this being, whether the being knows that it's conscious, that's a different story, but it becomes conscious of the environment and reacts to it. Algae in the ocean react to the rising and the setting of the sun. It's called the scattering layer. It's very interesting. I mean, in other words, it doesn't take animal life, though plant life reacts to it also. But the eye indicates that a form of brain is now present. And then with the origin of mathematics, in other words, language and then recorded language, writing, tells us that we now have totally abstract thought. And that's fairly recent time. And we're not really sure when it happens, but it's certainly appears to be somewhere within the last 100,000 or in that approximately, I don't give a number, but that's the numbers that I would say, several 100,000 years. And language, I think it's interesting to realize how abstract language is. I mean, I'm looking out the window and I see a tree. But the word tree has no meaning intrinsically, T-R-E-E. None of those three letters, T-R and E, put together to make T-R-E-E, is related in any way to a tree, but abstractly, I've taken that sound and related. So when I say that sound totally abstractly or write it out, I picture a tree. So we have this development, of abstract thought, which allows us to have conversations, as opposed to having to always speak in pictures. What does this all come to tell us? Well, it comes to tell us that we have certain questions that I think are really essential to ask. And those questions, I'm just trying to summarize a few of them here. The basic one is, why is there existence? There's a problem with being so immersed in existence from the time you're born that we don't even ask the question. It was Marshall McLuhan said it perfectly in the Medium's the Message. I'm not sure who discovered water, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't the fish. Now, why wouldn't fish discover water? Because it's the mirror all the time. There's just nothing without it. The same reason by the time we're old enough to ask, why is there existence? And then why is there consciousness? We've been immersed in existence and consciousness so long that it's a question we barely ask. But the fundamental question really is, why is there something rather than nothing? At this point, we could ask other basic questions. Is that, do we have a mind? And that's what we're really aiming at this session, at least, is do we have a mind that is separate from the brain? And do we have free will in the universe that has the laws of nature that control nature? And if we do have free will, how do we have it? How do we get around that control? Now, if I look at the world in general, what we do see is that the original form of life that survived, not the original forms, the original form of life, singular, because all life has the same DNA. It's a language. You can write on it pine tree. You can write on it Shakespeare. You can write on it equals MC squared, but it's the same language, and all life has it. And it's so complex and so compact, that to get it more than once, to get it even once requires an imagination if it is indeed formed by random processes. If there is this multi-universe belief for which there are no data that's, in my opinion, that support it, other than the statement that I once read in Scientific American, embarrassment, is the reason that we think that there are multi-universes is that our universe is perfect for life. And since those laws of nature that make our universe perfect for life, there must be other universes that are not perfect for life. I mean, that boggles the imagination. It boggles the imagination that unless you think I'm saying something that I don't have to back up, I will take the moment because it's such an embarrassment that science could actually have. One moment, I hadn't planned to show this, but at this point, I think I do want to show because it's absolutely crucial to realize, especially persons that are just entering the scientific world, is Scientific American. It's from several years ago, but I'm sure you can probably see this here. Scientific American, parallel universes. Infinite Earths and parallel universes really exist, and here's the logic. And I'm reading it right from the article. I want to make it clear that sometimes if you read data, this I say to all my students always, if you're getting information from a non-peer-reviewed journal, in which certain persons are willing to put their name, not on as the author, that's different, on the line that they say what this person wrote is true, be very careful about what you're reading, whether it's true. Here is Scientific Americans, and most of the only data that in fact imply that there is more than one universe with different laws of nature, so that one is going to be a winner. That's us. Cosmologists infer, notice that backtracking now, not really exists, but infer. Cosmologists infer the presence of these parallel universes by scrutinizing the properties of our universe. These properties, and they list them, they show how extraordinarily they match for us. These properties were established, the laws of nature we're talking about, were established by random processes during the birth of our universe. Yet they have exactly the values that sustain life, not that start life, that sustain life. They have exactly the values that sustain life. That suggests the existence of other universes with other values. It is embarrassing to see this convoluted logic in a journal that has the word science in its title. The fact that our universe is perfect for life is, according to this most widely read science journal worldwide, I think it is Scientific American, because it's not expensive, it's not peer-reviewed, which makes things expensive. The strongest evidence is for multi-universes is that our universe is perfect. There's no evidence whatsoever. Our universe is perfect for life, for sustaining life. But how did life start in our universe? There are no data that say this. So we have to, again, look for a force coming in that would juggle what we have, the material that we have that would make it good for life. Can that be by randomness? There's so many studies that show the math doesn't work that I won't get into that at the moment, but I mean, we were all familiar with these studies that randomness isn't adequate to show the development from energy to rocks and water to people sleeping through lectures. There's so much that has to take place that it's unlikely. Okay, so we have an origin of life, a first form of life, and nature got it right from the beginning. Notice that all life has the same DNA, which means nature chose a system. Language doesn't work that way. People speak English, people speak French, German, whatever. I mean, the whole language. So language doesn't work that way. Even the shape of the alphabet doesn't work. I can't read Russian, but there's enough nuances in the shaping of the letters that it makes it hard even to sound out the words. So when humans try to record information, we don't get a universally acceptable system because we had to have English and French and Spanish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the DNA language is universally acceptable. And that really does require an explanation. And the explanation, in my opinion, is that there is in fact this outside force, exactly as the scientific community has said, a force not physical, predates time, creates the universe from nothing physical. Okay, there's many systems that except that I neglected to look at my watch when we started talking. I want to mention, so what are the aspects of physics that would imply that there's something going on here in this world that is not necessarily obvious from the physical point of view? Well, the few of the ones that I would say that have come out from the study of the very small, the quantum, the subatomic reality of the world are things like entanglement, force at a distance with no connection between the two, yet the information seems to be transferred or instantaneously. Entanglement, tunneling, where the barrier of energy is too great, yet particles pass through it. Much of that seems to come from the wave-particle duality. And that becomes a fundamental piece of study here, or learning actually. There is a duality. The universe, our magnificent universe, is built with duality. We have wave-particle. I mean, a particle looks like this. A wave goes forever, but I think it was, I don't want to put a name, but who said, if all we knew of quantum physics turned out to be wrong, the GNP of the world would drop to zero overnight. So we have these unexplainable realities that we observe. It's not like you can derive with the brain of an Einstein, once it was shown by Michelson and Morley that the speed of light is constant, no matter how you measure it, running towards the source of light, running away from the source of light, have them more so moving, you always get the same number when you measure the speed of light. Once that was discovered, it took the brain of an Einstein, but it could be learned logically, the laws of relativity. He could learn, he was able to go beyond where they made these discoveries and then made the phenomenal statement. They're doing an inauguration at the University of Chicago that that all the laws have been discovered. Now it's just another decimal point. And then from the very study of the constancy of the speed of light, the c equals mc squared equation.
Prof. Schroeder, sorry to interrupt. There is about 5 minutes left. So if you are able to wrap up, you're talking about 5 minutes. So we have enough time to take questions. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
When it's about 1 minute, I'll look at my watch right now. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for telling me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Quantum, the laws of relativity is a brilliant, it took an Einstein to derive them, but they're derivable from the fact that the speed of light is constant. Okay, well, that's quantum physics isn't that way. Quantum physics is only discovered by observing entanglement, observing force at a distance, observing wave particle duality, which makes no sense. I mean, how can something be a particle and a wave at the same time? Or maybe it isn't, because you're in one at the problems become, well, what we do start to find here from these studies, and I want to just to wrap this up very quickly, a few statements by persons who spent their much of their lives studying the nature of how our minds or our brains work, and that one of them is George Wald, Nobel laureate George Wald, who originally his life was a materialist across the board, but then he made certain discoveries that just changed his understanding entirely. And he writes like this in the peer-reviewed journal Quantum Chemistry, Quantum Biology Symposium. It has occurred to me lately, I must confess, the shock to my scientific sensibilities. See, that's a materialist giving up the materialist view. That both the questions of the origin of life from non-living matter and the origin of consciousness in that life that arose from non-living matter might be brought to some degree of congruence. This is with the assumption that mind, M-I-N-D, mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has always existed as the matrix, the source, and the condition of physical reality. The stuff of which physical reality is composed is mind stuff, M-I-N-D, mind stuff. It is mind that has composed the physical universe and breeds life, and so eventually evolves creatures that know science and the arts and technology. In these creatures, which are us, the universe begins to know itself. It's not an isolated statement. Erwin Schrödinger, somehow I think we're part of that family. Erwin Schrödinger, okay? I mean, these are the studies that let these machines work that we're using. So in brief, we do not belong to this material world that science constructs for us. We, the awareness, the consciousness that each of us has a being, oneself, are not part of it. We are outside, we're only spectators. The reason we believe that we are in this world, that we belong to this physical picture, is that our bodies are in the picture, and that is our only way of communicating. That what we're seeing here is an understanding that there is a mind separate from the physical body, and it's that mind that is created to the universe. I only know the Hebrew origins of this, but I could quote you chapter and verse that say this thing from a few thousand years ago also, and I'm sure every person listening with whatever basic understanding, whatever cosmic understanding, would find the same thing, that there are indications in all of our I like to use the word religious, all of our life understandings is that there is something underlying this physical world, and it is what allows apparently entanglement, force at a distance, etc., these things to take place possibly. But an entity is telling us that that the physical world as we observe it is not adequate to understand the fact that we have a consciousness, and that consciousness seems to be outside of our bodies. And if it is the case, as Wald and several others that I'm not going to, Max Planck and others, consciousness is fundamental, from their studies, that there is a mind outside the physical body, our minds would then be splinters of that universal mind. And that universal mind, our individual minds, like a cell phone, like the cell phones are tuned to the portion of that mind that is relevant to us. And the brain may be the only system, that physical system, that is able to download that portion of the universal mind that's relevant to us. Just as right where I'm standing now, there are thousands of cell phone messages going through. My phone, I've got isn't ringing, I'm happy to say, but each person's cell phone is tuned to only one of those messages. The same would be exactly for the physical, for the mind outside the body, as Gerald Schroeder said it perfectly. We are not physical beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a physical experience, and the discoveries of the world below the atomic level, the quantum physics, has made it clear that there are aspects of this existence that are not logically associated with the physical world, and yet they act in the physical world. And with the mind being separate from the physical body, then the mind is not linked to the physical existence of the physical body, and which would then do two things. First of all, it will allow us to have free will, because there is no place for free will in the physical world. Either it's a deterministic world, which we now know is not the case, but that would be my mind. Okay. And then
Prof. Schroeder, sorry,
Finish.
can we wrap it up in another
Yes.
one? Yeah.
Okay,
Because-
just one sentence. The
Sure. Yeah.
world is not deterministic, so we have this quantum uncertainty, but that's also not free will, because now you have the randomness of what you're going to choose at the quantum level. So quantum physics does not give you free will. We have to have a mind separate from the body, and most systems of theological thought require this idea of having free will. For that, you have to break out of the physical world, which also then gives you a life beyond a life that exists beyond the life of the physical body. Call it life after death if you want to. Thank you for enduring this with me.
Thank you very much, Professor Schroeder, for this very enlightening talk and taking us through the timeline of the universe. We have a lot of questions actually now, and I would like to take some questions. We have about 5 minutes more.
Okay.
Yeah, so the first question is from Mr. Akash. He is currently studying at IIT Madras. So his question is it possible to prove the existence of God scientifically? His argument is science requires theories that are quantifiable, falsifiable, and repeatable. To prove the existence of God, do we have to change the definition of science itself, or is it possible in the current scientific scenario to prove the existence of God?
Well, for my tradition, okay, I can only speak for my tradition, I would say, although I have a video which has millions of views, Proof of God in 5 minutes, it's actually an overstatement. I do not believe that we can absolutely prove the existence of God. There are so many aspects that indicate a force outside of nature that is acting in it. But I do not believe, and for a theological reason, not for a scientific reason, for a theological reason, I do not think you can have absolute proof. The reason being that, at least in the Jewish tradition, I'm an Orthodox Jew, that you are required to choose your path of life. And if you could prove absolutely the existence of God, then you'd have to be either out of your mind or insane not to go according exactly to what that God says to do. So since the name of the game, at least in the Jewish tradition, is how you choose to run your life, that you have free will to run your life, that therefore it is not possible to scientifically absolutely prove the existence of God, but you can have information that is so overwhelming that it's like in a court of law. We can't prove, we didn't see him pull the trigger. We don't have any DNA that proves it, and the fingerprints aren't exact, but the evidence is overwhelming that he did pull the trigger. So the same would be here. The evidence, I think, is overwhelming for many indicators. I won't get into the indicators, but it's not absolute proof. So that long answer in a shortness, I do not think scientifically you can absolutely prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, absolutely prove the existence of our creator. For me, the creation itself is enough proof. But, okay, so the answer is no, I don't think so.
Thank you, Prof. Schroeder, for your answer. We can move on to the next question. And the next question is from Augustine Pampleni, who is from the Institute of Science and Religion at Cochin. The question here is, does the quantum vacuum violate the Democritan dictum that nothing can come out of nothing? Can laws of nature emerge out of nothing? So basically he's questioning about the initial Big Bang, that something come out of nothing?
Well, if God creates the laws of nature, as that wonderful quote that I took from the science building, and nature's thoughts are nature's laws are God's thoughts, then the creator of this universe would use those. The creator of the universe created, as that video. The creator of the universe created laws of nature. For some reason, I don't have any idea why the creator wants a universe. There are many things about love and giving, which I agree, but it doesn't prove it in my mind, but it's in logic, that the creator creates laws of nature. And the laws of nature allow allow a virtual reality become a physical reality. That's why that video should have said from creation from nothing physical, because there was the virtual reality, and that's what the quantum fluctuation allows. So once you have the laws of nature, namely, exactly as Ed Tryman pointed out in 1970 in his publication, in the journal Nature, by the way, it wasn't a soft publication, it was a hard publication, that quantum fluctuation can create a physical world from nothing physical, namely from virtual reality. Virtual reality and virtual particles do actually exist. I mean, that's just, or your transistors would probably stop working on the spot.
Right. So we can take one last question before we wrap this session up. So one of the last questions is, let me go through this. So this is, okay. So this is from Nabarub Ganguly. And his question is basically about understanding as to how did life evolve from non-living matter. Essentially, what he's trying to understand is life and matter different, because how can it evolve from something essentially non-living such as matter?
I think that's the difference between having laws of nature that are perfect for sustaining life, as I mentioned, but I have no idea. All the papers I've read on this subject do not present any logic, any reasonable approach to how life could arise from non-living matter. That's in that case, that the quote by Wald, because he's a biologist, is I think a very powerful statement. That mind would have to be present, a universal mind, the mind of a creator, in other words. That mind imposes on this non-living matter life. You don't, let's see, physically, physically, eventually, I would guess that you could take the chemicals, put them together, and end up with something pulsing like a heart or whatever. And in other words, possibly make something. But to have it arise spontaneously from the matter that is present in the universe, I do not think. We can't even say simplest forms of life, because there are no simple forms of life. All life is overwhelmingly correct. So I say, for me and for all that I've read, I think it was a Feynman that said, anyone who tells you that he knows the origin of life is either naive or a liar. Okay, I think that sums up right. I have no idea how life starts. But if I could ask, if all the questions, is there any way that I can get them on email or something? I know we have to wrap it up now, but will these questions be available? So
yes, they will be very much available. We are saving them, so we can send it over to you, because not all questions can be answered due to time limit. Yeah,
exactly. I realize that's what I'm asking. I would appreciate questions. Otherwise, I can't learn.
So thank you so much, Professor Gerald Schroeder, for taking us through the timeline of the universe and presenting some very important concepts. So I think we'll proceed with the next talk now. So the next talk is on God and Science by Professor Martin Nowak from Harvard University, USA. Yeah, and can we have the introduction slides? Yeah. So Prof. Martin Nowak is currently a professor of mathematical biology at Harvard University and director of Harvard's program for evolutionary dynamics. He is one of the leading researchers in the field that studies the role of cooperation in evolution. In 1989, he earned his doctorate in biochemistry and mathematics from University of Vienna. From 1989 to 1998, he was the Erwin Schrödinger postdoctoral scholar at the University of Oxford. He held professorship at University of Oxford and IIS Princeton before moving to Harvard in 2003. The next slide, please. Prof. Nowak's research interests include evolution of cooperation, evolution of language, evolutionary game theory and graph theory, somatic evolution of cancer, the dynamics of viruses and infectious diseases, pre-life and origins of life. He is famous for his proposal and works in showing evolution requires a third component called cooperation, in addition to the classical components of mutation and natural selection. Among his major discoveries are the mechanisms of HIV disease progression, the first mathematical approach for studying the evolution of human language, the first quantification of the in vivo kinetics of human cancer, and the 5 rules for the evolution of cooperation. He has published over 300 papers in the world's leading scientific journals, including several in Nature and Science. He is a highly cited researcher with the H index of 159. He authored many well-received books, including Virus Dynamics 2000, Evolutionary Dynamics 2006, Super Cooperators 2011, and Evolution Games and God 2013. Professor Nowak is a corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. For his outstanding works, he has received enormous international recognition, including Oxford's Weldon Memorial Prize, the Albert Wander Prize of the University of Bern, the Akira Okabo Prize for the Society for Mathematical Biology, the David Starr Jordan Prize, jointly awarded by Oxford, Cornell, and Indiana universities, and the Henry Dell Prize of the Royal Institute of London. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Nowak Martin. Thank you for joining us. Sir, you can start your talk.
Excellent. It's great for me to be here, and it was very impressive to listen to Professor Schroeder's lecture, and I'm very much looking forward to this interaction and your questions. How do I share screen? Can I share my screen?
You should be able to.
You should be able to share now, because earlier he was sharing. So you could not share. There is a share screen button on the down below your.
Yes, okay, I have it.
Yeah,
very good.
and then select the window.
So you can see now. And I can make, are you seeing?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's great. So you're seeing the slides as I advance them. So my talk is entitled God and Science, and I will talk specifically about God and evolution, but more generally about God and science. This is how I start my class at Harvard. Every year, I want to show the students a few dates that I think are the biggest dates that we have to remember, and that sort of anchor our understanding of time. There was a Big Bang, and there are different methods that give you the same answer of 13.8 billion years ago. Then very precisely, we understand the origin of our solar system to have come about 4.567 billion years ago. And if we then, so these are like physical dates, and then we are interested in when did certain things happen in the biological world. So almost everybody assumes there was an origin of life on Earth. You know, it could have been different. It could have been that Earth, in fact, was fertilized by bacterial spores, but most scientists think there was an origin, but we don't really know when that origin was. All we can say, by 3.5 billion years, there's definite evidence of simple cells, so-called prokaryotes. And then it took a long time until we get higher cells, eukaryotes, and the definitive evidence is 1.8 billion years ago. And so higher cells are those with a nucleus and cell organelles. But it took a very long time for them to come about. But obviously all higher organisms, animals, plants, and so are made of those higher cells. Complex multicellularity came about 600 million years ago. And if you ask, what is the biggest event in the evolution of life on Earth in the last 600 million years, there's sort of one answer, and the answer is human language. And why is human language sort of as important as the origin of life itself or those other things? And the answer is because it gives rise to a new mode of evolution. Before human language, evolution is just restricted to genetics. But with human language, we have evolution on the level of human information in a digital realm, in a linguistic realm. So if a person has an idea, the idea can spread worldwide. We don't have to wait for genetics to evaluate the idea and fix it in the population. So humans evolve differently than other animals. Humans evolve both genetically, but that's even less important these days. They also involve first and foremost in this new medium of human language. And that came about approximately in order of the last 1 to 10 million years. Can you hear me? I have problems. Oh, here, maybe I need to advance here.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, perfect. And so, as Professor Schroeder said, nobody really knows how the origin of life happened, but there are some ideas out there, and many researchers work under the assumption, that this is more or less what must have happened, and one day we will understand how an origin of life comes about. But in a sense, researchers in that field work under the assumption that there are chemical cycles on a planetary scale, and then chemistry generates certain substances that I call monomers, and these monomers can give rise to polymers. So this would be the origin of nucleotides. And I would actually call this pre-life. And pre-life for me is a combinatorial chemistry that does not yet have reproduction, because biology and evolution comes after reproduction. So once some of those polymers can reproduce, we can talk about evolution. And evolution with natural selection is then a force that can give rise to complexity. And for me, the interesting thing in that area is, what is the force that gives rise to complexity before evolution? And that's precisely the engagement of pre-life. And that's a theory that I proposed. Many people assume that at some time there was an RNA world, because RNA is a molecule that has a very interesting structure, and it can store information, and it can catalyze chemical reactions. But this RNA world was not independent of protocells. So there were like lipids, and under the right condition, lipids can give rise to vesicles, and vesicles can spontaneously fuse and divide. And so one could imagine that there are these vesicles with some RNA inside that were like precursors of cells. But as Professor Schroeder has said, life is very complicated. And there is no such thing as a simple cell. Like the simplest cell is more complicated than a star. And so it is unclear how exactly that happened, but sort of science works under the assumption that there is clearly a scientific explanation for an origin of life on a planet. And I would also subscribe to that. I would definitely think that it is just standard chemistry. Given enough time, given enough scale, on some planets, life can come about. Of course, we have to realize there are many Earth-like planets in the universe, and the current estimate is maybe 100 million or 1 billion in our galaxy alone. So afterwards, we have RNA recruiting proteins, and proteins can help. They consist of an alphabet of amino acids. They help RNA to reproduce. They help RNA to produce more proteins. And finally, DNA becomes the carrier of genomic information. And now what we have here is the central dogma of molecular biology, that the information flows from DNA to RNA to proteins, because DNA is more stable than RNA. And we arrive with these steps at the world of bacteria. So 3.5 billion years ago, we have a world of bacteria. And the interesting thing is, biologically speaking, not much has changed since this last, since 3.5 billion years ago, because you can ask the following question: how many cells are there on Earth? How many biological cells exist on Earth? And if you want to have an estimate, all you have to do is to count the number of bacteria, because everything else is just a small modification. And the current estimate is that there are 10 to the 30 bacterial cells on Earth. That is 10 to the 30 cells on Earth. So bacteria still dominate in total in terms of cell number. And here is the timetable of evolution. This is a joint paper with Andy Knoll at Harvard University. And on top, you can see the 4 eons of Earth's history. So there's the Hadean, the Archean, the Proterozoic, the Phanerozoic, and then all the events that happened that we can sort of time in those in that unfolding. So there was an origin of life, but we don't really know when. Around sort of maybe in the Hadean or early Archean, around 4 billion years ago. And in the Archean, we have then biological carbon and sulfur cycles. We have then oxygenic photosynthesis. oldest known eukaryotes, simple multicellularity, origin of animals, and so on. And then down here, we have the last 540 million years extended. You know, we have the emergence of macroscopic animals. We have the plants colonizing land, anthropods colonize land, and so on. Then we have the dinosaurs. And finally, we have primates, hominids, Homo sapiens. I want to draw your attention to these two big steps here that are called GOE and NOE, because this is the great oxygenation event and the Neoproterozoic oxygenation event. And these are the two steps when the oxygen concentration increased in the atmosphere. I have done this here in that following slide. So we have again the time scale 4.5 billion years ago. And for half of the history of the Earth, the oxygen concentration was low. And then suddenly oxygen concentration increases. And the oxygen concentration increases approximately 10,000-fold, maybe 1,000 to 10,000-fold in this great oxygenation event. And afterwards, it was possible to produce eukaryotes. And there's a very strong causal relationship between the increased oxygen and the eukaryotes, because the eukaryotes were aerobic organisms. They used oxygen to burn substances to get energy. So it's very clear that they would come about only after there's enough oxygen. And then there's a second step where the oxygen concentration increases another 10 to 100-fold, and that gives rise to animals and plants, and that is also logically related because they need really high oxygen concentration to bring energy fast enough inside. So these small organisms don't have an inside, they are just sort of surface, if you like, and then these organisms have inside, they need to bring energy inside, and for that you need a lot of oxygen to provide that energy. So the question is, because this explains the timing of unfolding of life, what explains why the oxygen increased in these two steps? And the interesting suggestion is this was not caused by evolution as such, but by the planet. So the planet had a change in physical structure, and that was the formation of continents. And the formation of continents allowed the oxygen to accumulate that was produced by cyanobacteria. If the planet would not have formed those continents, nothing may have happened. And that explains the GOE in that theory. And what explains the NOE is the breakup of the supercontinent into several subcontinents. So again, the planet is determining the time frame. And I find it very interesting. So the idea here is that we are not waiting for evolution to make a discovery. Evolution is ready. Evolution just adapts to what the planet is prescribing. So here's the following view. In physics, we understand that stars make chemistry. And physicists understand very well at what time in the life cycle of a star, which chemical elements are being produced. So I suggest a similar idea in biology, that planets, that is some planets, a small number of planets, but there are many, make biology. And they make biology at certain stages in their life cycle. So once again, we have discovered many planets in our system, in our universe, and the estimate of the Earth-like planets that have the right size and the right distance from the parent star in our own galaxy is at least 100 million, maybe even 1 billion. But we are seeing 10 to the 11 galaxies in our observable universe. So actually, we are expecting to be surrounded by 10 to the 19 Earth-like planets. And I find that suggesting the possibility that the universe is abundant with life. The question is it also abundant with intelligent life in the sense of humans? And I will come to that. So what is evolution? Evolution is actually something surprisingly simple, but we have to ask the following question more precisely. What is it that evolves? And the answer, what is it that evolves, is the population. The carrier of the evolutionary process is a population, not a species. We talk about evolution of the brain, we talk about evolution of the genes, but the only thing that really evolves is a population. populations evolve, populations of reproducing individuals. This could be cells, animals, plants. They could be ideas if we talk about non-genetic evolution. And then you have, mutation. And mutation means that there's a new type emerging. And then you have selection. Selection means that different types over time grow at different rates. That, for example, this red cell here could be fitter than these blue cells, and therefore it increases in abundance. And this is the idea of selection. So for a long time, mutation and selection were considered to be the only forces of the evolutionary process. And sort of over the last 20 years, more and more, I have proposed that there's a third fundamental force of evolution. And this third fundamental force is actually cooperation. And cooperation somehow means that there are units that are working together, they help one another. And as they help one another more and more, they form a new level of organization. And so this could be the emergence of multicellularity, or the emergence of the eukaryotic cell with cell organelles, or the emergence of human society. And so I have argued that cooperation, so what is cooperation? Cooperation is an interaction where there's a donor and there's a recipient, and the donor pays a cost and the recipient gets a benefit. So this cost and benefit are in terms of fitness. I give up some of my reproduction, I reduce my fitness, I increase your fitness. I help the other person to be more successful, the other cell to reproduce faster. And natural selection opposes cooperation. So if we have a population of cooperators and defectors, natural selection without anything else always favors the defectors until everybody is a defector in the end and cooperation is destroyed. And therefore, natural selection needs help to favor cooperators over defectors. And this help is given in 5 mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And these mechanisms are interaction structures of organisms, individual cells or people. And these 5 mechanisms, so there are thousands of papers on evolution of cooperation, and I have proposed that they can be subdivided into those 5 categories: direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, and kin selection. And I described them in my book, Super Cooperators. But here are 3 examples of cooperation. And this is a kind of cooperation that existed 3.5 billion years ago on Earth. These are cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria form filaments, strings. Every so often a cell dies in order to feed the others with nitrogen. So this cell here does not reproduce, it helps the others to reproduce. 3.5 billion years ago. 125 million years ago, the origin of the ants. These are workers, and these are the larvae of the queen. The workers do not reproduce, they help another individual to reproduce. So Darwin was fascinated. Why does natural selection design a worker ant to be so perfectly equipped for what it does when it has no offspring? It has no offspring. Nevertheless, natural selection has designed it to be perfect in its function. And the answer is the evolution of eusociality here. And for ants, this happened 125 million years ago. And here, an example from our own time. So this is a painting of Vincent van Gogh of the Good Samaritan. And so this is the idea, of course, that humans help one another. We have an instinct to help one another. And what I propose is that cooperation and not competition is actually the master architect of evolution. And in all of those steps, in the step from prebiotic chemistry to RNA world, to proteins, to genomes, to cells, to bacteria, eukarya, complex multicellularity, insect societies, people, in all of those steps, animal society, people, it is cooperation that has played a crucial role in each of those steps. So I think more than just competition and fight, it is helping one another that is the fundamental idea of evolution. And then I also observed that in certain mechanisms, such as direct and indirect reciprocity, the winning strategies of cooperation are generous, hopeful, and forgiving. And I think that is an interesting observation because if evolution is just based on fight, if evolution is just based on conflict, then why would God want people to be different, so different? Why would God want people to help and love one another? And I say, I think we see the traces of this already in sort of those aspects of natural selection that favor cooperation, in that the winning strategies are generous, hopeful, and forgiving. You want to help others. You hope you can collaborate with strangers, and you can forgive the mistakes of others. And in the last few years, I've been working very much on a game theory of love, asking the question whether game theory can motivate love. So now the second part of my talk, and the second part of my talk is what is the relationship between God and evolution, and what is the relationship between God and science in general. It's interesting that when Darwin's theory of evolution spread in England, it gave rise in philosophy and in larger parts of society to this view of naturalism, in the idea that God is not needed for anything anymore. So this very strong turn to materialism or naturalism is actually a consequence of sort of the spread of Darwinian evolution, and therefore evolution has a central role in this debate between science and religion. So a common view is that science supports materialism. Materialism is sometimes also called naturalism. So materialism is the perspective that the material universe is all there is, and that there's no place or need for God. And many scientists, especially those that speak very loudly and so have this idea that this is the only possible view that you can adopt if you are a scientist. And I think this is an incorrect interpretation of science. In my opinion, science does not suggest materialism, and we will examine the reason. The reason is science clearly points to an underlying, unchanging, immaterial reality. Science demonstrates there are mathematical laws of nature, and these laws are immaterial and timeless. Science shows that the material world of change is embedded in a much greater immaterial world that is unchanging. If we think of something like the Newtonian laws of physics, they are formulated in terms of mathematical equations, or Schrödinger's equation of quantum mechanics. We have mathematical equations that formulate eternal truth, according to which the material world is instantiated. And this is really the path of science. And this is the path of science not only in physics, but now also in biology and in every field of science. So I argue, as science spreads to more and more fields, it will become more and more mathematical. So mathematics takes the center stage in any scientific understanding, and mathematics obviously exists independent of the material world in a kind of Platonic heaven. In philosophy, we would call this a Platonic heaven, and the idea would be mathematical Platonism. So there are two worldviews. Worldview one is reality is exhausted by material temporal objects. And worldview two is reality contains material and immaterial, temporal and atemporal objects. And a deep examination of science, in my opinion, clearly favors 2/1. So science does not say reality is exhausted by what is material. As opposed to this, science clearly shows that the fundamental truths of science and of mathematics are immaterial and timeless. This goes back already to the origins of Western philosophy, and here is the center part of the famous painting by Raphael of the Athenian Academy. The painting is in the Vatican, and this shows Plato and Aristotle, and Plato points to heaven, and Aristotle points to earth. Plato and Aristotle, two of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition, and Aristotle, of course, was the student of Plato. And he never really wanted to fully agree with his teacher, but he examined everything that his teachers sort of has told him. And Plato is a realist. He points to heaven. He believes in a real existence of Platonic forms. And Aristotle is an immanent realist. He still believes in the real existence of the forms, but they are inherent in matter. So they disagree on some points, but they agree on a very fundamental point. These two philosophers agree on the following point. To be is not the same as to be material. This is a conclusion that they have reached already at the very beginning of Western philosophy. So not everything that is material. There is a world that is not material. And that for Plato, of course, is the much more fundamental, that's the much more important world. This is the world where real truth lies. And this is the world where every kind of human understanding has to be anchored. So this is the world of the Platonic forms, and this is the world of mathematical objects. So science leads us to the divine, in my opinion. And I think this is really a game changer. And it would be very nice to spread this message in the world that science, as much we admire science and we admire the scientific method, it leads us to the divine. And the question now is, what is the divine? So the question is, what is God? And we already find answers to that question in Greek philosophy. And this is what I find fascinating, because Christianity, but also Islam, as it is now, also Judaism, in my opinion, would be unthinkable without the input of Greek philosophy. So what is God? And the answer of Plato and Aristotle and others at the time would have been the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the primary cause, the highest form, the form of the good that illuminates all other forms, because it is good that those other forms exist. So I have asked the question, what is God? And first I give you the answer of the philosophers. You know, this is the answer of the philosophers. If you like, the scientists, the generalized scientists, this is not yet the answer of theology. So what is God? And the answer of the philosophers, the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the primary cause, the highest form, and so on. The answer of the philosophers continues. One of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition, equivalent sort of in stature to Aristotle and Plato, maybe one of four of that magnitude in Western philosophy, is Thomas Aquinas. And as a child, he asks the question, what is God? And the teacher could not answer his question. And so later in his life as a theologian and philosopher, he gave the answer. Deus est ipsum esse per se subsistens is the very important Latin sentence that Thomas Aquinas formulated. So God is being itself, subsisting in itself. There are many different translations into English, and that's sort of a very verbal one. So God is his own being, God is his own existence. I will continue with that. God is existence, according to Aquinas. Everything else has existence given by God, but God is his own existence. In God, there is no distinction between essence and existence. So in every other being, there's a difference between essence and existence. In every other being, what a being is not the same as that it exists. But in God, there's no such distinction. And this is the theology of Aquinas, but this is sort of embraced in most traditions of Western Christianity. Therefore, God is in a unique ontological category. So the ontology is the theory of being in philosophy. What is it that exists? And God is in a category of his own. God has within her, the sufficient reason for her existence. God is uncaused, depending on no other cause for her existence. So this is a positive definition of what is called divine aseity, that God has within him the sufficient reason for his existence. And it's a negative definition in the sense that God is uncaused. God does not depend on anything else for her existence. And as a consequence of this, it is proposed that God has no parts of any kind. And I find it elegant because a complex would depend on its parts for existence, but God depends on nothing for its existence. And therefore, God is free of any composition. There's no distinction between God and his attributes. God is identical to his attributes, and they are identical to each other. God is her wisdom, God is her love, God is her goodness, but her love is her wisdom, her goodness is her existence. And this is the idea, the concept, the doctrine of divine simplicity. So God is identical to her attributes, but every attribute is the same in God. So God's love is also God's wisdom, and God's goodness is also God's existence. So for a being to be wise is not the same as to be wisdom. Socrates is wise, but Socrates is not wisdom. But for God to be wise means that God is wisdom. For God to love means that God is love. And that is somehow the view that Aquinas helped to develop, which permeates much of Christian philosophy. And out of divine simplicity, as a consequence, you have divine necessity, and you have also the fact that God cannot change over time, because change would be a modification of real attributes, but all his attributes are the same because of divine simplicity. So again, looking at science, looking at philosophy, we realize underneath this world of change, there's an unchanging reality. And for me, this is also the message of the Bhagavad Gita that has influenced me more than any other spiritual writing in the last 10 years, I would say. Underneath this world of change, there's an unchanging reality. Every human being is part of this unchanging reality. Mathematics studies this unchanging reality. Science studies the material world. But the language of science is mathematical, and this is the connection. So God is not an object within the universe, is not caught in the flow of time. This is a mistake that is made by many people who think that science suggests there is no God. They have a version of God, which is not the God that is discussed in the tradition of philosophy. God creates ex nihilo, out of nothing. This is a concept that goes back to Augustine. God holds every moment in existence. Therefore, God is not only creator, but also sustainer. It is not only God who sets everything in motion, but God is needed to hold every moment in existence. Divine action is needed for every event. Divine action is not in competition with a scientific process. God is the primary cause for evolution and all laws of nature. So again, what is God? And as Thomas Aquinas says, you can come to God as a philosopher. And if you're a philosopher or a scientist, you can study God by its effects. So you can study God by what God has caused in the world, but you cannot study God directly. If you're a theologian, however, you can also study God directly by looking at revelation and sacred scripture. So what is God? I am who am, I will be who will be. I am the existent one. So this is the revelation of God to Moses in the Hebrew Bible. I am who am, I will be who will be, I am the existent one. In the words of the very famous philosopher and rabbi Moses Maimonides, God is a fathomless ocean of being from whom all things originate. Beside him is no second, beyond him is no other. And this is the English translation of the words that you know very well. This is my favorite chapter in the Bhagavad Gita. I'm the true self in the heart of every creature. Of luminaries, I'm the sun. In the night sky, I'm the moon. Among scriptures, I'm the Samaveda. Among senses, I'm the mind. In living beings, I'm consciousness. Among bodies of water, I'm the ocean. Among words, the syllable Om. I'm the repetition of the holy name. Among mountains, I'm the Himalayas. Among forces which restrain, I am Yama, the god of death. Of all that measures, I am time. I am the beginning, middle, and end of creation. I'm the science of self-knowledge. I'm logic in those who debate. I'm infinite time and the sustainer whose face is seen everywhere. I'm death which overcomes all and the source of all beings to be born. I'm the feminine qualities, fame, beauty, perfect speech, memory, intelligence, loyalty, forgiveness. Among seasons, I'm spring. I'm the radiance in all that shines. I'm the silence of the unknown and the wisdom of the wise. I'm the seed that can be found in every creature. Without me, nothing can exist, neither animate nor inanimate. There is no end to my divine attributes. I've mentioned only a few. Wherever you find strength, beauty, or spiritual power, they have sprung from a spark of my essence. I support the entire cosmos with a fragment of my being. So in thee abide fixed forever, the first causes of all things unabiding, and all the things changeable, the springs abide in thee unchangeable. And in thee live the eternal reasons of all things unreasoning and temporal. Thou awakest us to delight in thy praise, for thou madest us for thyself, and our heart is restless until it reposes in thee. And these are words from Augustine of Hippo, who was sort of the first great Christian philosopher, who led sort of to the understanding of God that we have in Christianity these days, and the marriage, in my opinion, between Greek philosophy and Christian Jewish tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, I think.
Sorry, my mic was switched off. So thank you, Professor Martin Nowak, for taking us through the timeline of the universe. And I find it particularly interesting about one point which you mentioned about cooperation being the third important principle after mutation and selection. And also the planet being the director and evolution simply adapting to it. That is one of the, I found that point very interesting. So there are a few questions and I would like to start with Dr. Jayanti from Navi Mumbai. So her question is, what is the difference between unchanging reality and God? Are they related? Yeah, that's her question. When you refer to unchanging reality, does it mean God? Are they related, or are they, or do they mean two different things? Yeah.
In my opinion, God is not the same as everything that exists in the Platonic heaven that is in the truth of mathematics, but these are ideas in the mind of God. So the unchanging reality for me is part of the creation. There could be a creation that is material, and there could be a part of the creation that is immaterial. And the Platonic heaven, the mathematical truth, in my opinion, would be part of the immaterial, unchanging creation by God. So God is intimately related to both the material world and the immaterial world. I would not necessarily entertain the view that the immaterial world is equivalent to God. But one could analyze that direction. But I would not call it equivalent. But the material world would not be present without God. So it is not the case that God has to accept a Platonic heaven, but God wills a Platonic heaven.
Okay, thank you for your answer. We'll take the next question. And this is from Dr. Malika Arjuna from Korea. She would like to ask that science leads to the divine. What are the scientific process to lead to the divine?
I think what I mean by science leads to the divine is that two things. So one, the scientific examination of people, as the process how scientists study and analyze the world, makes us realize that scientific understanding is most fundamentally in terms of mathematics. And mathematical truth is eternal. So if you say Newtonian mechanics or quantum mechanics or relativity theory, there are mathematical equations there that are eternally true. And therefore science leads from the examination of a material changing world to an immaterial unchanging world. And that's the first step, in my opinion, toward God.
Okay, thank you. There's another interesting question, and this is Nikhil from CMRIT Bangalore. And the question is, why in the divine simplicity, God was referred to by her? If there is
so I like to so it is clear that God has no gender, and normally in these papers it is he, but because God has no gender, I would like sometimes to use she and he, because in English we have this distinction between he and she, but God has no gender.
Okay, thank you. The next question is interdependence of organisms for food is an example of cooperation, the third rule of biological mechanism?
It could be. So there are examples where cells feed each other. So a cell produces one substance and feeds another cell with that substance. This is called cross-feeding, and this cross-feeding is an example of cooperation, yes.
Okay. There's another interesting question, because you specifically mention in your talk about language as being one of the factor for evolution. And the question with regards to that, is human language born out of our consciousness? How does it evolve? Yeah.
No, I think so. There is, you can examine somehow the biological trajectory that gives rise to animals, that have something like communication and that have something like human language. But in addition to this, there is sort of language links us to meaning, and meaning and fundamental truth and mathematics. And obviously this is not a product of evolution. So the Platonic heaven that we can now examine with language and that gives us meaning is not a product of evolution. It was a very famous statement of Noam Chomsky actually long ago, that language is not the product of evolution. And I was very surprised by that statement. And the statement does not mean, that there is not an evolutionary process that has given rise to the human brain that then is able to speak. But if you examine language in its full implication and width, so to include somehow mathematics and meaning and Platonic forms, you are actually talking about something which is not the product of evolution, like mathematics for sure is not the product of evolution. The human ability to do some mathematics is the product of evolution.
Okay. Then there's another question we can take. I think one more question, I suppose. Yes. And this is related to, again, your talk on evolution, right? So as you mentioned, there are three directors of evolution, which is cooperation, mutation, and selection. So one of the question is it possible to bring consciousness into the evolution theory as well, as being one of the main director as well?
So I don't know, I have tried somehow to explain how evolution can give rise to beings that have something like human language. But I have not succeeded, to formulate an evolutionary theory of consciousness. But I also think, that consciousness, depending what you really mean with it, is clearly not a material phenomenon, in the same way as the human soul is not a material phenomenon.
So you
so
clearly,
the human soul is not the product of evolution.
Right. So consciousness is something else, right? It's not a product of chemical reactions.
No, I think for me, consciousness has something to do with human free will, as Professor Schroeder said, and it has something that I would call the human soul. And for me, the human soul is not a material object.
Okay, thank you. And there's one more. One of the questions is, are viruses an exception to evolution?
No, viruses are also generated by evolution. The interesting thing is we always talk about one origin of life, but viruses are actually, they evolved, they originated many different time points separately. They are alive, in my opinion. They sort of need cells to replicate, of course, but also cells need environment to live. So viruses are not an exception to evolution, they are a consequence of evolution, and they very often represent independent origins of living systems because they can come about from genes that become independent and so on.
Right, so we can take another question is about, because you have philosophically represented different views on God just now in some of your ending slides. So the question is, based on your study, is God with or without form? Is he with any gender or there's no gender?
So I think that God has no gender. And whenever we talk about God having an attribute, so is God with form or without form? Whenever we ask, does God have an attribute? Then it is a God has an attribute always different than every creature has an attribute. So for example, when we say Socrates is wise, then being wise is not the same as being Socrates. Socrates could also stop being wise with senility or so. But for God to be wise is the same as to be God. So God is his wisdom. So whenever we talk about attributes of God, we have to realize we never fully understand this, and therefore Aquinas calls analogy in that place. So we talk about God having attributes in an analogy as a creature has attributes, but it is always an analogy. So God is wise, means that God is wisdom. God loves means that God is love. So if Socrates is wise, then only by participating in God's wisdom. If humans love, then humans love by participating in God's love.
Right, so we can take one last question. Is about language evolution. So the question is, why different languages have evolved? Or
the languages like species, they separate. It has been described as an analogy that different populations separate and then different species come about. The same for language. So as humans separated, don't interact with each other anymore, different languages can come about. So there are about 6,000 different languages on Earth, and many of them are threatened by extinction.
Okay, I think we can end the session here. Actually, there are many more questions, but I think possibly we can send them over to you. I think there are at least 10 or 15 more questions. So
you can also distribute my slides if you like.
Yes, sure. Okay, thank you. Then thank you, Professor Martin, for your very enlightening talk. And can I pass it back to the chair now for the next session?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much once again to both the speakers, and thank you, Dr. Nikhil Bhat, for chairing this session.